I want to talk for a moment about what's called the nebular hypothesis. If you take any course in college or high school in astronomy, you'll encounter a thing called the nebular hypothesis. Where did the planets come from? And there's a modern myth that is taught in textbooks and in school, which is not true, but widely taught. I want to call our attention to this, the nebular hypothesis. It runs something like this, and I'm quoting from Immanuel Kant, one of the classic expressions of this hypothesis. Some 4 billion years ago, the sun had ejected a tail or a filament of material that cooled and collected and thus formed the planets. That's a summary that you'll find in many different ways in many different textbooks taught today in college. But I'm quoting here from Immanuel Kant himself. Actually, he didn't invent this idea. 21 years earlier, it was published by Emanuel Swedenborg. It was published in Latin in 1734. Now, Swedenborg, you need to understand, was a guy with a lot of broad interests, so an engineer with many interests, who claimed to have psychic powers. And he got this idea in a seance, apparently, or some such thing. He claimed this was confirmed by the nebular hypothesis in seances with men on Jupiter, Saturn, and places more distant. Are you getting a little suspicious of this idea? I hope so. Some 20 years earlier, in 1712, Swedenborg was then 24 years old, and he happened to have an opportunity to visit with Edmund Halley, a very famous astronomer at Cambridge, and Halley very famous for his predictions about comets and so forth. So Swedenborg trafficked with these kinds of people and those kinds of ideas. In that same era, Pierre-Simon Laplace, a very reputable mathematician, lent his endorsement to Kant's theory, but without checking the mathematical validations that he was capable of doing. He didn't bother to check the math. Laplace didn't. Therefore, Kant, who picked this up from Swedenborg, it became considered valid, widely taught, and is to this day. And it's not true, by the way. Provably not true. And what's tragic is Laplace had the depth and mathematics he could have, if he'd done his homework, refute this thing back then. But anyway, the nebular hypothesis gained widespread respectability despite it's got very serious mathematical problems. And subsequent writers have continued to develop variations of this idea, even though the more they study it, the more it becomes obvious that it can't be true. And I'll show you why. I'm reminded, I couldn't resist putting this in here, I'm reminded of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. One can't believe impossible things, Alice laughed. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And of course, Lewis Carroll is poking fun here, but it fits the foolishness that we proliferate through our textbooks and our educational system. The difficulty, the sun turns out to have 99.86% of the mass of the solar system. If you take the total solar system, almost, not 100%, but almost 100% of the mass is in the sun. It's huge compared to the planets and so forth. And yet, the sun contains only less than 2% of the angular momentum. It has all the mass, but not the spin. The 9 planets contain 98% of the spin, the momentum. The more you think about that, the more absurd it is. You got most of the mass is not spinning. All the momentum is the energy. The momentum energy is in the orbits. There is no plausible explanation that would support a solar origin of the planets. The planets did not come out of the sun. They were brought here and got caught by it. James Jeans, again a classic mathematician, pointed out that the outer planets are far larger than the inner ones. That's hard to explain. Why are the larger ones, the ones that are outside, larger? Jupiter's almost 6,000 times as massive as Mercury. It's almost 3,000 times as massive as Mars and so forth. And this is also a difficult. You try to come up with some theory how that happened, you find yourself contradicting yourself. There are other enigmas. The planets are here in 3 pairs. There are 3 pairs of rapid spin rates among our planets, each of which are within 3% of the other of its mate. They're almost exactly the same spins. Why? We have Earth and Mars spin almost at the same speed. Jupiter and Saturn, almost exactly at the same speed. Neptune and Uranus. Why is this? Nobody knows. It implies that they came in pairs somehow. Earth and Mars also have identical spin axis tilts. The axis of their spin match. Why? It implies something, but not conclusively. From the angular momentum and the orbital calculations, it is deemed by many of the scientists that these planets came in pairs and were brought here by some other object. Something else caught them, came close, and it capped the orbit. You have to get into the orbital mechanics to really try to dramatize that. But there's more to it than that. Why does Mars have 93% of its craters in one hemisphere and 7% in the other? As we explore the planets with NASA probes, they're all pockmarked. By the way, one thing you quickly discover is our solar system is a rough neighborhood. It's been beat up really badly, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But Mars has 93% of its craters on one side and only 7% on the other. In fact, it would seem that 80% of these craters occurred within a single half hour. Determine that because it's spinning all while this is going on, right? Why is that? Nobody knows. These raise legitimate scientific questions. The planet Mars is the fourth planet from the sun. It's named after the Roman god of war, not by accident. Most of the early civilizations on the planet Earth were terrified of the planet Mars. Why? We regard ourselves as sophisticated space-age people, right? Could you go out in the night sky and point to Mars tonight? Only if you're an astronomer or have an ephemeris. I'm an astronomer. I wouldn't be sure. I'd have to do a little homework to be sure what I'm looking at. Mars is the Baal of the Old Testament. Why? Why were they so terrified of Mars? You need to understand that science people who indulge in these kinds of studies fall into two groups. There are uniformitarians, and that's the majority of people. They cling to the presumption that things have remained essentially unchanged over billions of years. Most scientists presume that whatever's true today was true billions of years ago. They're called uniformitarians. There are scientists that feel just the opposite. They're called catastrophists. They believe the universe has not always been the same. It's been subjected to a series of catastrophic events. And the evidence of those catastrophes are in what we see. And we try to infer what's happened. And people who believe in creationism would fall into that category, by the way. If you're a fiat creationist, and I assume most of you may be, then you would be in that second category. Back in June 30th of 1908, in Tunguska, central Siberia, there was an impact of some kind of meteor. It's very famous. It destroyed 2,000 square miles of forest. It was so remote from civilization, it wasn't explored until 17 years after the fact. 1925. Whatever happened there is equivalent to a 15 megaton nuclear warhead, to give you a rough feeling of disaster here. If you know the Winslow crater in Arizona, you're familiar. It's 1 mile across, and there are others of these in the Yucatan Peninsula, 1 6 mile in diameter, 100 megaton equivalent. There have been things that have impacted the Earth. That's the whole point I'm making here. In fact, scientists estimate that it happens about 1 every 300 years, and 1 in 3 of these are on land, the rest land in the ocean. But they still continue. That may surprise many people. There's a meteorite in Mecca that created the Kaaba that the Muslims worship. The word Cairo in Egyptian is the Arabic word for Mars. That may surprise you. That's the site of the Great Pyramid, not by accident. In Athens, the word in Greek, Ares is Mars. It's pictured as a source of judgment. Aregopolis, Mars Hill. Why is Mars always associated with war? There's a reason for that we will come to. And take a look at any surface in our solar system. You get plenty of opportunity to see NASA photographs of any of the planets. You'll always notice, look at our moon. Get a pair of binoculars, take a look at our own moon. Everything you find in the solar system has got pockmarks from being beat up. Our solar system is a rough neighborhood. We are under a constant rain of interplanetary debris on the Earth. about 100 tons of extraterrestrial material per day. Over 100 creators on the earth. It may surprise you. Well, in the Bible, we find an interesting event called the sun stood still in the book of Joshua. We now know that the ancient calendars, all of them, were based on 360-day years. All ancient calendars, most of them have 12, 30-day months somehow in their basic structure. But in 701 BC, they all change. Calendars earlier than 701 are 360 days. Subsequent, they change. They do all different kinds of things. The Jews add a month every 3 years, sort of. Not quite. The Romans added 4¼ days per year and so forth. It's interesting that Mars was worshipped by the ancient cultures. There's a theory that's been surprisingly validated that Mars made near Pass-Bys the planet Earth. You see, they believe now, what they know about orbital mechanics, that Earth and Mars originally were on resonant orbits. 360 days for the Earth, 720 for Mars. But they were in such a way that they made a near pass-by every 108 years. And those are recorded on the planet Earth, by the way. And this would account for catastrophic events that we have records of on a number of occasions in history. Energy transfers apparently stabilized in 701 BC, and that's what stabilized the calendars. And by the way, to make the sun stand still, you don't have to stop the spin of the Earth. All you have to do is change its precession. Would cause the same effect. So the idea of the Earth being on a 360-day orbit, Mars on a 720-day orbit originally, but pass by twice a year. Not every year, every 108 years it turns out. There's a resonant orbit, Earth 360, Mars 720. When they had a near pass, in the spring, March 20th, 21st, it would pass on the inside after perihelion, that is where it's the closest. It would be ahead and lose energy. Earth would gain a little, Mars would lose a little. If it was aphelion, furthest away from the sun, it would be outside, passing behind the Earth, Earth losing a little, Mars gaining a little. Always a little adjustment. And that finally stabilized in 701 BC. That's a theory. I'm not going to give you the whole length of it, except to indicate that the stabilization resulted in the Earth being 365¼ days, where it finally stabilized, and Mars 720 dropped down to 687, where it is today. Now, this theory has a great deal. If you're interested in this, you want to get into our Joshua background because it has a great deal to say about it. But the surprising thing is that this seems to have been validated by Jonathan Swift. You say, how? What are you talking about? Jonathan Swift wrote some children's stories called Gulliver's Travels. Yes, he did. Early telescopes. In 1610, Galileo developed his telescope, and he discovered the 4 moons of Jupiter and Saturn's ring. Big deal in 1610. Herschel, 1781, with a better telescope, discovers the planet Uranus. Big deal. 6 years later, Herschel discovers the 2 moons of Uranus. Big deal. 1789, a couple of years later, he finds 2 more moons of Uranus. See, our skill with telescopes was improving. 1846, Leverrier discovered Neptune and one of its moons. 1877, a guy by the name of Asa Hall, using a brand new telescope at the U.S. Naval Observatory, makes history by discovering with his new telescope the 2 moons of Mars. And he names them Deimos and Phobos. Why was it so hard to find? Because they're only 8 miles across and they're almost black. They have an albedo, a reflectivity of less than 3%. So they're hard to find. But they were able, Asa Hall discovers it in 1877. And they're very unusual because one of them is going backwards. Everything in the solar system goes in one direction. One of these happens to go backwards. Deimos, it's almost a synchronous orbit, 30 hours and 18 minutes orbit, and Phobos is the one that goes backwards, eastward, if you will, and it's only 8 miles in diameter. It has a reflectivity of only 3% albedo. Well, why am I getting into this? Get the date, 1877, we discover the 2 moons of Mars, right? A guy by the name of Jonathan Swift, an Irish political commentator, wrote a series of stories that were supposed to be political satire. We know them as children's stories, called Gulliver's Travels. Okay? Now, he published that in 1726. Most of us know the first voyage of Gulliver with the little people, the Lilliputians. The third voyage of Gulliver is a story you may not have read, where they go to Laputa. And the astronomers in this particular venue brag that they know about the 2 moons of Mars, and the astronomers in London don't know anything about it. And in the story, the size, the revolutions, and the orbits of those 2 moons of Mars are specified within 20% accuracy. And the fact that one of them is going backwards. Now that turns out to be bizarre because Jonathan Swift wrote his children's story 151 years before the astronomical world discovered it. Did Jonathan Swift know that? No, of course not. He apparently drew upon some legends to embroider his story, not knowing that those legends apparently had their origin in eyewitness accounts, because there were no telescopes that could see it in those days. This turns out to be a shocking corroboration of the near Pass-By hypothesis, 151 years before. So the whole idea, all I'm getting across here is to understand that our solar system is subject to shocks that the astronomical world has closed their eyes to, pretty much.